When you see Mario, you think Nintendo. When you see Sonic, you think Sega. But which character makes the average person on the street think of Atari? Oh, I've seen lots of wildly varying answers in that regard, from the Fuji logo to E.T. to Pac-Man to Pitfall Harry and more, although some of those couldn't be the Atari mascot since they don't belong to Atari. Now, today I'm going to tackle the gaming brand Mascot, and in particular, Atari's mascot potential. The lack of clarity on this subject existed back in 1995 when Atari was struggling to compete against Nintendo, Sega, and soon Sony. According to Atari artist BJ West, management thought that the reason they were failing wasn't because of the games, but because of the lack of a mascot. As such, they commissioned artists like himself to cook up a new mascot, but as Mr. West would put it, they didn't understand that the reason the likes of Mario and Sonic were successful were because the games were fun. Still, when you're employed at a place and they ask you to do something that fits with the job, you do it. For his part, BJ came up with Ally the Alligator. This might have worked with the right game, but it never got past paper. One project that did get past the paper, however, and I'm not sure who came up with this design, was Oswald. This got as far as a slightly playable demo, with this very 90s blocky nerd looking to become the face of Atari. We can all count our lucky stars, that never got anywhere. This whole effort was a bit baffling to me though, as I will demonstrate. Atari already had a bunch of characters to choose from. Why it is that nobody at Atari seemed to remember this, I don't know. But today I'm going to lay out what the characters, or many of the characters, were at Atari. Now, not every one of them is mascot-worthy, but we should at least give them a look, and then we'll determine which one could make most sense for carrying the whole brand on their shoulders. Now, what makes for a good video game mascot? It has to be a character that makes you instantly think of a brand, of course, but in terms of video games, this means that they are tied to a game that millions of people can relate to as they enjoyed it. If Super Mario Bros. Had just been a derivative Pac-Man clone, nobody would have remembered it today. Both the original Mario Bros. Game and Super Mario Bros. Were fantastic titles that created an interesting world that people could get into. A bad or forgettable game will mean that no one will care about the starring character, and the 90s were full of these mascot attempts, including one that Atari recently reacquired by the name of Bubsy, which I'll get into later. Other aspects that seem to help a mascot become what it is include the character having some kind of unique ability, power, or feature set, like, say, Sonic's speed, or Kirby's eating and morphing abilities, or Rayman's versatile limbs. It also helps for them to have a supporting cast of characters, both good and bad, especially a memorable villain or villains. It also is good if they are able to function in other genres of gameplay, such as a Mario being Dr. Mario, or different sports titles for Mario, or Mario Kart, etc. And then being cute also seems to help, although that's not entirely necessary either. Now, are mascots themselves necessary to a company's success, like Atari in the 90s was thinking? No, of course not. Sony's done pretty well without one, although I suppose you could say something like Ratchet and Clank or God of War fit that bill for them. But still, nobody really thinks so much of Sony as having that character like Nintendo does. They tend to seem to talk about it in terms of the PlayStation itself is almost the character. I also couldn't tell you who the mascot is for EA. The challenge for Atari would be finding a character that could be adapted to the different game genres, as I mentioned, while introducing new base games for the character that keeps things fresh. Nintendo has been the best in this regard, where they've reinvented Mario in particular many times. They've reinvented The Legend of Zelda many times, and so on. But of course, some of their games do stick with the pretty much original formula that they came up with. Still, for most of Atari's characters, it was introducing new games and sequels that was lacking over the years. But there's still potential there as long as the right vision is put in place to make great games out of them, say a creative and artistic vision as opposed to let's see how much money we can squeeze out of this stone vision. Before you ask where Marble Madness, Paperboy, Gauntlet, Xybots, Primal Rage, and Area 51 are at, in June of 1984, Atari Incorporated was dissolved, and The home division was sold to Jack Tramiel and renamed to Atari Corporation. The arcade division stayed with Warner and became known as Atari Games. Many employees on the arcade side always felt that the true Atari was with Coin-Op because that's how the company got started and most of the major hits came out of their division. The rights of who owned what was a little messy, but keep in mind that for any arcade game released under the Atari Games label, starting with Return of the Jedi, those creations, characters, and IP did not belong to Jack's Atari Corp. Thus, and so on, are not under Atari's control today, or what's known as Atari SA. Those IP are presently owned by Warner, and Atari Games' ownership changed hands over the years. I won't get into all that, but the end result is that Warner still ended up owning them. They also own all the Midway IP. Going way back into Atari's history, the first time a discernible character appeared on one of their games was an ocean diver in the game Shark Jaws. I say discernible as their maze game Gotcha could technically count, but that was just a dot and a plus symbol. There was no character drawn on the game cabinet itself, nor on the flyer. Shark Jaws had a rudimentary depiction of a deep-sea diver looking to take out a great white shark, all unlicensed, of course. This character could also apply to their diving game Aqua Venture, developed for the Atari 2600 in the early 80s, but unreleased until the Flashback 2 came along in the mid-00s. Would this be mascot-worthy? Probably not, because there just wasn't much done with them. Same goes for Steeplechase, which came out right after Shark Jaws. It does depict horse jockeys, but there isn't much you could do with that, nor the prisoner guy depicted on the Breakout marquee, although with Breakout, that prisoner would show up in some materials for Super Breakout, as well as in the recent Breakout Recharged. And so, in a way, that is a character that's, I guess, being remembered a little bit, but it wasn't depicted in-game, it was just in artwork. One game that came out a month before Breakout did feature an anti-hero, and that would be Outlaw. Obviously inspired by popular Western films and shows, this game seems to pull inspiration from Clint Eastwood's famous depictions of a lone Old West wanderer. Very few people know that this was in arcades first, released a couple of years before the famous 2600 port, although the games share a little in common. The arcade served as a fast draw light gun arcade game, while the 2600 version was more of a variation to combat. Mascot potential here is minimal, although if you wanted a swarthy bad boy character juxtaposed against the cutesy alternatives, I guess there's that. It was later in '76 where George Opperman had been brought into the company to give Atari's products a more creative and artistic flair. It wasn't long after that he had joined that the company attempted to dabble into pinball, where George began creating characters to adorn these games, as pinball is a very heavy, artistically infused product. The first release was The Atarians, which featured a man and a woman battling it out against the thugs of some cosmic sorcerer, but they weren't given any particular names. George's designs would frequently feature a dynamic duo of a man and a woman, although it's not clear if they were always intended to be the same characters or not. You can see these pairs on Atari's next pin, Airborne Avenger, which had a kind of James Bond or spy flick flair to it. Then there was Middle-earth, which had nothing to do with Lord of the Rings, but instead involved dinosaurs with being shot at with laser guns or something. And then finally, there was the sci-fi motorcycle pin Space Riders. The only exception from George's side was with using these dynamic pairs was Time 2000, which did feature a kind of angelic fairy, but no other dude was on that particular pin. The art from these pins carries with them enough imagination that it's a shame that they've been forgotten about over the many years. When it came to Atari carts, they would have made for great level themes. But to the point of mascots, the male hero in these designs would eventually be given a name of Commander Martin Champion. He was effectively Atari's first mascot, and one that could be easily adapted to any of the company's space games or even others. Need a commander for a space mission? Call Champion. Need him for some military combat role? Well, sign him up. he was a Marine anyways. You need him as a driver in a car, he's the go-to guy. Since so many of Atari's games involve vehicles, since that's what a lot of early hardware could draw better than it could depict people, he and his feminine companion could be an easy drop-in for those. Aside from the Atari Force comics, though, where it's not a blonde but a ginger by the name of Lydia Perez, I'm not aware if they ever had a name for the lady on the pinball machines. Now, when the commander was retroactively given an official name and a backstory and the mascot role, this all came into focus when Atari began creating the Atari Force comic book series that I just mentioned, and that was done by DC Comics. And these comics were included with select Atari 2600 games, often serving as a way to integrate all sorts of Atari releases into one comic book. Atari Force number 1 did this. It came with Defender on the 2600, incorporating elements from that game, Berzerk, which wasn't an Atari IP at the time, but it is right now, Combat and Lunar Lander all into one. This comic would also introduce Dr. Lucas Orion, whereas issue number 2 introduced Mohandas Singh and Lee Sun O'Rourke. This crew would technically star in Atari's Liberator arcade game, a title launched in November 1982, right before the big collapse happened with E.T. and all that. Never ported to any system, Liberator only sold 762 units, thus remaining rather obscure. In the game, though, only Martin Champion was named. Champion would also be retroactively inserted as the hero commanding the Star Cruiser in Atari's smash hit and killer app Star Raiders. Atari Force comic number 3 detailing the discovery of that ship, and the comic was included in the 2600 version of Star Raiders. As mentioned, he could effectively be put into the pilot seat of any spaceship, and so games like Star Raiders, Asteroids, Orbit, Lunar Lander, whatever, he would work for that. He probably could have been made the tank commander in Battlezone too. So overall, the mascot potential here is pretty strong, since he was effectively the company mascot for unofficially the end of the 80s, and then officially between, I'd say, 81 and 84. Stepping back to 1980, another character who surprisingly never got an official sequel back in the day would be Adventure. One of the biggest hits on the Atari 2600, the game is a predecessor to adventure titles like The Legend of Zelda. Players could imagine themselves as a knight out to save the kingdom by retrieving the chalice, although you were just a square dot, and so the imagination is the one that really had to fill in the blanks there. That game would introduce various memorable villains, not so much the evil magician that's mentioned in the manual, but the 3 duck-like dragons, Yorgel, Grundle, and Rindle. For some, these would serve as Atari's mascots in a way, or at least mascots for the Atari 2600, although they only starred in this particular game. A sequel to Adventure, an official one, was planned back in 1983, but it was never finished. And then a sequel by the name of Adventure 2 was released in 2007 and programmed by Cafe Man. Released on the Atari 5200, he's long been working on a version for the XE computers, but it's notable that this game was given Atari's official blessing, and a 2600 version was also created for the Flashback 2 console. The mascot potential here is okay. We've seen knights or adventurers gain notoriety out there, such as Link from The Legend of Zelda, who obviously makes people think of Nintendo when they see him. Although it's not quite a versatile one that goes into other genres. Those duck dragons, though, it's too bad that Atari never did more with them. On the subject of adventure-like games, this is a good spot to mention some other medieval fantasy titles that had characters in them. The first one came along in 1982 as a pseudo-sequel to Adventure called Sword Quest. Designed as a puzzle adventure game for a nationwide contest, Sword Quest games came with a comic book that players had to use to unlock the mystery for a chance to participate in the contest. There were some very expensive prizes up for grabs from that, including, of course, a really nice sword. Fortunately, it seems that the 3 grand prizes that were eventually won have all been lost, although rumor always had it that the Tramiels had the sword hanging above their fireplace. Anyways, the game itself depicts a single person that you control with far more detail than was ever seen in Adventure, and the cover art as well depicts these twins, a man and a woman, who would not be Commander Champia or Lydia Perez. It would instead be a pair of fraternal twins that were thieves by trade named Tor and Terra. Later in 1988, Atari needed an answer to Gauntlet. Remember, they didn't own anything from Atari games. And so they had an adventure game from the Atari 400 and 800 called Dandy, repurposed into a title called Dark Chambers for the Atari 7800 first, and later for the Atari XE XL game systems. The characters depicted on the cover art differ from those in-game, where they almost look like Robin Hood. Out of all these, it's probably easiest to adapt Tor and Terra to the roles, although for their mascot potential, you would really need to revitalize both Adventure and Sword Quest to the quality level of something like The Legend of Zelda, without being too derivative of the latter. The year after Adventure came out, Atari had 3 more mega hits on their hands that would come with some mascot potential. The first was Centipede, launched to arcades and soon ported to consoles. It was a big smash hit. It was Atari's second best-selling game right after Asteroids as far as the coin-op went. Now, Centipede, of course, is more focused on the centipede and the spiders than the hero itself, although this was fixed in the home versions where the box art as well as the included comic book gave the game a proper story. You are now Oliver, a gnome in the magical forest battling against the bugs. Given the popularity of Centipede, they could have certainly pushed this further, and the game showed up on everything except for the Lynx and the Jaguar, although there was an unreleased version of Centipede for both systems. In the case of the Jaguar, there was Centipede 2000, which was supposed to be in 3D and have RPG elements to it. And of course, there was Centipede released to the Dreamcast and PC at the end of the 90s, I believe it was. Now, there was the sequel Millipede, and with that, they did create a pretty elaborate story to explain the character and the situation, but you weren't a gnome anymore. Instead, you were a royal prince that is known as the Archer. Of course, this story is not found anywhere in the game itself. It's all contained on the sales flyer, which most people would never read, but it was also depicted on the cabinet's side art. Millipede received a lot less love than the original game on consoles and arcades too, but ultimately the memorable character from this game is the Centipede itself. That makes the mascot potential a little weak, as most people aren't fans of bugs, but perhaps the Knight from Adventure could have filled in the role what was given to Oliver or the Archer, or vice versa. Oliver or the Archer could have been the Knight in Adventure, who knows? Next up was Yar's Revenge on the Atari 2600. Now, this is an interesting one. The game would sell millions of copies and establish an unconventional hero as well as a villain. Yar was a metallic spacefaring fly, and the Qtile was a mechanized planet destroyer. Yar is the most articulated and feature-rich hero up to this point, with the ability to survive the vacuum of space and fly around the galaxy without the need of a spaceship. He had the ability to eat anything, plus fire small shots, and command the Zorlon cannon. While it would be a challenge to slap Yar on everything like Mario has, doing a Dr. Yar game probably wouldn't work. More could be done with the base concept. Unfortunately, no one has managed to do a particularly memorable Yar sequel yet. There was a remake in 2011 that changed things up to be a little bit like Panzer Dragoon, as I recall, but it was received with pretty mixed reviews and it's been forgotten about since. There was a Yar's Recharged release recently, as well as a nice little remake as a part of the Atari 50th Anniversary Collection, but these pretty much stick to the original formula and don't expand on it too much. The mascot potential here is still good, although like with Centipede, bugs aren't generally endearing to most people. The third one from this year was one that Atari's tried to turn into a mascot the most out of every character that I've mentioned up to this point, as well as ones that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's received the most remakes over the years, and that's Haunted House. Now, this was an original title for the 2600, and it was a predecessor to survival horror games of the 90s and beyond, but it wasn't until the 2000s that someone at Atari decided that it would make the best IP to remake over and over and over again. But overall that's had mixed results. As I mentioned in the recent news about another Haunted House remake coming soon, Haunted Houses on the Atari 50th Anniversary Collection is the best take I've seen on it, excepting the original. The mascot potential, however, is okay. It's not really versatile to have a pair of eyes versus, say, Mario. That's just not going to really compete there. But we'll see how things go with the new Haunted House, as they seem to have a whole team of characters, so that would give him a supporting cast and a named character and all that. So we'll see how that goes. Next, we'd have to jump to 1983 for our next potential round of mascots, starting with Charlie Chuck. Who? You mean you haven't heard of Charlie Chuck's Food Fight? If not, then that's too bad, as it's a fun little game where you play as a kid on a quest to eat an ice cream cone, and you get to throw food at chefs along the way. The arcade cabinet was kinda neat too, but it only sold around 2,000 units, which wasn't great at the time, and it only received ports to the Atari 7800 and 8-bit computers much later. A new remake of Food Fight is in the works, so we'll have to see how that turns out. Otherwise, the mascot potential here is meh, just nothing great, as Charlie Chuck's really just a kid who gets to, or has a good arm at throwing food, so maybe it would be good in a remake of Real Sports Baseball or something. Or Charlie Chuck's Baseball. Or Charlie Chuck's Food Baseball. I don't know. Another original creation from '83 has some crossover with Commander Champion, and that is Major Havoc. This was a space combat / platformer game, and it was quite innovative and ahead of its time. It would also be the last original creation out of Atari to use a vector monitor. Now, I admit that Major Havoc is one of my personal favorites to come out of Atari, but due to using the hated vector monitor, and when I say that I mean it's hated by arcade operators because of high failure rates, it only had about 300 dedicated units made and a few more in kit form. Either way, it's rare enough that it's often called a holy grail among arcade collectors, and it fetches exceedingly high prices. Where I own and operate an arcade, I would not pay $5,000 for one just because I know it wouldn't make that money back, and so it would be a bad business investment. But if money were no object and I wanted to get a holy grail for my house, it would certainly be at the top of my list. Now, it also never received any kind of home port to boost its popularity among gamers, and it never got a sequel. There was talk of Jeff Minter doing a Major Havoc 2000 for the Jaguar, but that doesn't seem to have made it very far, maybe not even beyond talk, or at least a design document. I don't think that the mascot potential here is super strong unless you replace Commander Champion with them. I mean, they're kind of similar, although Havoc does have the cooler sounding name. It should also be noted that long before Sonic the Hedgehog popularized the tapping foot over the player not moving, Major Havoc did it first. The strongest mascot candidate came out in July of 1983, some months before Major Havoc. Bentley Bear from the arcade game Crystal Castles. I used to own one for many years. This isometric maze game was essentially like Pac-Man, as you worked to clear the mazes of crystals, but despite superior graphics and a twist on the often copied gameplay, it wouldn't surpass Pac-Man's popularity in any reasonable or major degree. That said, if you grew up in the 80s, then you'll recall the cultural obsession there was with teddy bears at the time. You had the Ewoks in Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, as well as those two weird kids movies that they did about them. You had the Care Bears, you had the Teddy Ruxpin talking toy bear with a cassette tape in his belly, you had the Row Bears and Thundercats and so on. People still like teddy bears today, so that all works to nail down the cute factor for Bentley Bear, and it also makes him easy to adapt into other genres of games, as I'll get into in a moment. Although Bentley's power set isn't really anything impressive. He can jump, he can take out gem eaters when they're in the middle of swallowing a gem, and he becomes temporarily invincible when wearing his magic cap. Now, with another game that came along, but not from Atari, that is something that works to add one extra ability, and that's the ability to throw gems. Of course, you can expand on these things. There's nothing that says that has to be locked into these power sets, especially if they aren't like set up like Mario or Sonic. I mean, obviously with Sonic, you wouldn't want to change his speed factor or anything. That's pretty crucial to the character. But when you didn't start off with anything super amazing in the first place, like with Bentley Bear, then, well, you can probably take some license there and add something on later without it really ruining the character. Now, after the arcade release of Crystal Castles, possibly because of the sale to the Tramiels several months later, Bentley faded into obscurity. It did get a few ports to Atari consoles, and at the end of the Jaguar's life, there was a game called Atari Karts, where Bentley Bear was the only selectable character, but that was pretty much it. And again, it seems like the Tramiels kind of forgot that they had that there for whatever reason. Otherwise, there were no other sequels or follow-ups to keep him in the mind of the public until Bob DeCrescenzo would finally make the effort to give Bentley a second wind with Bentley Bear's Crystal Quest on the Atari 7800 Pro system. Often compared to Adventure Island or Wonder Boy, this brought a much-needed platformer to the Pro system and showed that the character could indeed work in other styles of gameplay like a platformer. It also demonstrated that the graphics on the 7800 could achieve a lot more than thought if you just looked at its original release games back in the 80s. The mascot potential here is very high. As mentioned, he's got the cute factor down, and while his power set isn't particularly impressive, you can adapt that. He can work in other genres and platformers, both 2D and 3D. Many times I've seen people say that he would probably work in a game that's like Super Mario 64. He could work in puzzle games, probably even strategy games, and works in racing games, as he did in Atari Karts, and so gets all those things down. Now, the very last arcade game release under Atari Inc. was also the most revolutionary, called iRobot. While the gameplay wasn't exactly mind-blowing, the graphics were. This was the first game that would use filled 3D flat-shaded polygons, the building blocks of 3D games today. Yes, these graphics were in 1984 and very rudimentary compared to what we have now, and this game also came along about a decade before arcade machines and consoles really started pushing the 3D envelope. Now, in iRobot, you play Robot 1984, who's on a quest to destroy Big Brother without jumping. For obvious reasons, this wasn't ported to home consoles, although it's a little surprising that they never gave it a try on the Atari ST, since that could handle some basic 3D graphics and software. In fact, it could handle them a little bit better than the Amiga could. That was one of the ST's fewer, stronger points, I guess. But it also could have been an Atari Jaguar launch title. But again, they must have forgotten that they even had it in their repertoire. Or they just thought it was too old and that so few people had ever seen it that they didn't even know it existed. I mean, it didn't sell super well. Estimates put the arcade sales between 750 and 1,200 units. Overall, the mascot potential here is okay. You can give the robot some personality, and pretty much any personality. It's programmable, right? And they can be adapted to various games at least, but hard to say how much robots that look like this are endearing to the public. Before the company changed ownership, many employees had been laid off or quit, and with the takeover, this brain drain of creative talent accelerated further. A lot of the talent who had created the iconic games stayed with Atari Games or moved on to other pursuits. Jack was immediately focused on creating a new computer system, the aforementioned Atari ST, and internal game development slowed considerably, but eventually there were a few new characters to come out of the woodwork. Also, I need to jump ahead for a moment here. There are some games which were released on the likes of the 2600, 7800 Lynx, and Jaguar, where the rights to the game did not go to Atari, and thus the present-day iteration of the company does not own them, and so that's where I'm not counting them. To the best of my knowledge, these appear to be games like Secret Quest, Off the Wall, which had a character named Kung Fu Lu. There was Midnight Mutants on the 7800 with Jimmy the Zombie Slayer. You had all of the Epix games released on the Lynx, along with most other titles on the Lynx, sadly, as well as most of the games on the Jaguar just are not Atari IP. That said, there are still a few games that we can find a character in and look at their mascot potential, so let's take a look, starting with Ninja Golf. Released on the 7800 in 1990. This is a hybrid sports beat-em-up game that's gained a lot of notoriety out there. particularly on the internet, just due to its quirky premise, although the game itself needed some polishing on the beat-em-up part. The ninja's never given a name, so I'll propose one of Nine Iron Ninja. It could have been reused in any game that doesn't take itself too seriously, such as the reboot of The Idea or some other Atari sports title. Maybe a comedic take on Atari's real sports series, and say call it Ninja Sports, and he could be using golf clubs instead of katanas, or katana golf clubs, something like that, I don't know. Also, in 1990, you had Scrapyard Dog and a Mario-like character named Louie. Now, of course, Atari needed something to compete with the plethora of platformers that the NES had, particularly Mario, as keeps being mentioned. But, of course, there were many other platformers on the NES, and people who had a 7800 wanted a little bit of that love, a little bit of that action. And so that's where we got Scrapyard Dog. Now the character here, Louie, he is a guy with a giant schnoz, which looks like he got stung by a bee on the nose. Not sure why they went with that design, it's a little weird. And otherwise, the game is a solid platformer, and it's both on the 7800 and the Lynx, but again, it was no match for Nintendo's output, so it's not really sought after outside of Atari circles. Hopping on over to the Jaguar, we had Trevor McFur, which was one of 2 launch titles for the platform. I had a whole video about how I would remake this game. It was obviously an Atari alternative, or the character was an Atari alternative to Fox McCloud of Star Fox, although the goofiness of photoshopping cat heads onto human bodies makes the character seem more tongue-in-cheek. Just watch that other video if you care to see that one, but I don't think he has much mascot potential. Also on the Jaguar was the aforementioned Atari Karts. Now this is a strange game from the Jaguar library, which was an answer to Mario Kart, but despite holding the Atari name on it, the only things Atari about it are the inclusion of Bentley Bear and the names of the circuit cups. The rest of the game was an original creation of developer Miracle Designs, but either they didn't realize that all the characters they had access to, or they didn't care. I'm not really sure. I could do a whole video about this one, but if you were to remake the game, you could pull from all the titles and the characters that I mentioned up to this point, so you could drive those characters, and you could theme the courses after various Atari games, including the pinball machines. I think there was a lot of potential there in that regard. But for the game that was released, there's no original character that would come from this game that would work as a brand mascot, other than Bentley Bear. And then we had Fight for Life. This is the last game released under the Tramiel flag, introduced to us. The last game is called Fight for Life, and this was the last title released under the Tramiel flag for the Jaguar, and it introduced us to several new characters, with one of them being a ninja. Maybe that could be Nine Iron Ninja, but no one from the group really stood out like Ryo from Street Fighter or Akira Yuki from Virtua Fighter, although if this game were resurrected, there isn't a character I would cut. It's just that there's none that would really serve as a brand ensign. After the Tramiels sold the company to Hasbro, they fiddled with it for a few years before selling it off to Infogrames. That company then changed their name to Atari, with the entity being known as Atari SA. It's a bit difficult to navigate everything that they own in addition to the Atari IP, just because they've sold off a lot of IP through the years, including Battlezone, and they used to have a document on their website that laid out all the IP that they owned, but they've since pulled that, and I haven't been able to get any confirmation on all the characters. With that said, there have been some recent acquisitions by the company which does expand the character roster. The first one that probably made the biggest amount of news was their purchase of Stern Electronics. And from that acquisition, the highest profile character would actually be a villain, and that's Evil Otto from Berzerk. This game also has the pixelized human, usually depicted as a guy in the artwork, although that role could be filled by Commander Champion or Major Havoc or anyone else from the Atari force for that matter. Either way, it is cool that this game kind of came full circle, as the artwork that Atari was able to produce back for the 2600 and the 5200 consoles was a lot cooler than anything that Stern Electronics pulled out. They also bought M Network, but there isn't much from that apart from Anteater. I mean, I suppose you can make it a cutesy Anteater out of this, but bears would be more lovable, so I'd stick with Bentley. Or you could integrate the Anteater into the Bentley Bear universe, perhaps as a friend or one of the supporting cast. Perhaps that's the best way to do it. And then another recent one was Accolade and Micropose. With over 100 titles acquired, there's quite a few characters to be found in the mix here, although it's a little bit of a mess to figure out since Atari hasn't mentioned the exact titles that have been included. Not everything that Accolade did back in the day was their original creation. Sometimes it was a port of somebody else's work, and so they wouldn't own the character. One that I'm not sure about is Turrican, which, if they did grab that, it would give Atari an answer to Metroid. But again, I'm not 100% sure if that was included in the deal. One game that definitely was, though, was one that could be considered a famous mascot type character, and that's Bubsy. Bubsy was a smiling bobcat who seemed to be targeted towards Sonic, or competing with Sonic back in the 90s. Now, the thing is, though, he doesn't really have any standout abilities, and some of the games that were released under his name, including the Jaguar version, weren't very well reviewed, but perhaps the worst out of the whole bunch was Bubsy 3D on the PlayStation. It could still be used with the right game, although it seems to me that certain things would have to change with the core concept to make it more fun and memorable, and of course upgrade Bubsy with a stronger power set. Now, there could be a few others that I could mention here, like the Tempest Claw, but ultimately only a few would be capable of carrying the brand. Granted, this really depends on the game too. As I mentioned, a good character tied to a poor game can either ruin it or diminish the brand. Just ask the Sonic fans about that. But we also have to concede that characters like Bentley or Bubsy need to have a little bit more added to them to become a little more palpable for wider audiences. But at the very least, they do seem to hit the basics of what a mascot needs. So in summary, the top 3 Atari-owned characters with the best mascot potential would be Bentley Bear, Commander Champion, and Bubsy. Now, which of them would be your top pick? Is there a lesser character that you would think would work better than one of these? Which one is your favorite villain? Is it Evil Otto? Is it one of the duck dragons from Adventure? Is it the Centipede? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks for watching this mini documentary about the mascot potential of Atari characters.